A reading from the book of the prophet Isaiah. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. For a child has been born for us, a son given to us. Authority will not rest upon his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His authority shall grow continually, and there shall be endless peace. He will open the eyes of the blind and unplug the ears of the deaf. The lame will leap like a deer, and those who cannot speak will sing for joy. He will bring justice to all who have been wronged. Who has believed our message? He was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with the deepest grief. We turned our backs on him and looked the other way. He was despised, and we did not care. Yet it was our weaknesses he carried. It was our sorrows that weighed him down. And we thought his troubles were a punishment from God, a punishment for his own sins. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our sins. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole. By his bruises we are healed. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all.
It was night. Outside in the streets of Jerusalem, shadows fled before a full moon rising over the pinnacles of the temple. Time was ebbing toward its close and its beginning, the cleft that would, for the rest of recorded history, mark it before Christ, after Christ. This was the last night of Jesus' life on earth. He had looked forward to the occasion, having his own apostles, his chosen friends, his intimate companions grouped around him in the fellowship of the Last Supper. 12 men were reclining on couches around a low, U-shaped table. At the master's left was Simon Peter, at his right, John. A quiet voice spoke. I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Bronzed hands took a loaf of bread, gave thanks for it, broke it. This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. The Last Supper was to institute a memorial, the loving desire to be remembered. All eyes were on the Master, and he softly said, Verily I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me. The apostles were shocked. Peter blurted out, Lord, surely it isn't I. And one by one they all asked, Lord, is it I? So Christ took a piece of bread, and dipping it in a bowl of hariseth, handed it to Judas. Slowly, Judas rose to his feet. He strode toward the stairway. Then, pausing, he turned and faced Christ. An awful look passed between them. Then he turned and was gone. There was silence. The 11 men who were left were very quiet. It was only a matter of hours until Christ and his disciples would be separated. He wished to fill those last hours of fellowship with the tenderest and most significant of his teachings. His voice was very soft and low. Little children, a new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you. By this all men shall know that you are my disciples. Abide in me, and I in you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. These things I have spoken to you, that in me you might have peace. In the world you shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. The Last Supper was over. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out into the dark and deserted streets.
It was nearly midnight when the group of 12 men left the upper room. The Passover meal was over. They passed through the valley and moved up the hill toward one of their favorite meeting places, a garden called Gethsemane. Here in the deep shadows of the night, moving along in the deeper shadows of the trees, they halted. Jesus and his disciples stopped, and they stood there looking across the valley at the holy city of Jerusalem. Jesus turned his eyes toward his circle of friends. This would be the last time that he saw them before they abandoned him. He knew what they would do when the soldiers came. And then he turned and he stepped into the garden. And he invited Peter, James, and John to come with him. He told them that his soul was overwhelmed with sorrow to the very point of death. And he began to pray. Never had he felt so alone. What must be done, only he could do. The apostles were weary. Some sat on the ground, others propped themselves against the olive trees, and they fell asleep. The spirit was willing, but the flesh was weak. And while they slept, Christ prayed, kneeling, imploring. His hair was plastered to his wet forehead. He agonized. Is there then no way? No other way? Jesus looked across the garden at his dearest friends. They were asleep. His yearnings didn't stir them. His distress did not move them. He stood and he walked through the shadowed trees, and he bent down before them. Please, please, he said, just stay awake with me. The Lord of the universe did not want to be alone. Being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like great drops of blood falling to the ground. Already he was living the pain of it. All of this in order to prove finally and forever that no evil is any match for the Father. Could ultimate triumph come in no other way? Abba, Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. And God gently but firmly said no. the worn face glistening with sweat, bowed in final surrender. As he stood, the anguish was gone from his eyes. His fist would clench no more. His heart would fight no more. Jesus had made his decision, and he was at peace. Nevertheless, Father, not my will, but your will be done.
The stillness of the garden was suddenly broken by the sound of voices. And now a flickering torch came into view, and another, and another. There were soldiers, temple guards, temple doorkeepers, little priests with big ambitions. Out of the crowd there stepped a familiar figure. It was Judas, a half smile upon his face. "Hail, Master," he said, and kissed him with a kiss that must have burned Christ's cheek. Thus identified, Christ was seized and bound with ropes. The disciples, too, were caught in the trap. After a moment's hesitation, some of them seemed to gain courage, to think of fighting in defense of their master. Peter drew from the folds of his cloak a short sword and recklessly struck a vicious blow at the nearest enemy. It happened to be the high priest's servant, and the blow severed his right ear. When Christ saw what Peter had done, he quickly commanded him to put up the sword. "They that take the sword shall perish with the sword." The method of Peter was the sword. The method of Christ was the cross. Peter sought revenge. Christ sought reconciliation. Peter cried, "Give me a sword and we can advance the kingdom." Christ cried, "Give me a cross, and I, if I be lifted up, will draw all men unto me." And so they led him away as a butcher might drag a steer to the slaughterhouse.
They led him to the house of the high priest, Caiaphas. Caiaphas was afraid of the common people, and the popularity of Jesus was largely with the common folk. Stories of his wonderful works were everywhere. It was said that he healed the blind. There were cripples who had thrown away their crutches. There was a story about a little girl who had been dead and had been restored to her father. And now the latest story, the one about Lazarus, a prominent citizen being brought back to life. With such power and a growing following, anything could happen, and it made Caiaphas uneasy. The Galilean must be silenced. The members of the Sanhedrin sat on stone seats in a three-tiered semicircle. The court had hastily been convened in the middle of the night. Witness after witness came forward. But the witnesses could not agree among themselves, and the prisoner refused to say anything. Caiaphas grew red in the face with mounting frustration. He had already risked much to bring Jesus to trial. He rose from his seat and walked over to where he could look down into the calm face of the prisoner. If the witnesses could not condemn him, he must try to get him to condemn him himself. The silence of the Nazarene angered the high priest. With all the authority he could crowd into the words, Caiaphas put to Jesus the solemn oath of testimony. I adjure thee by the living God. Now, when a question was put like that to a loyal Jew, it was an offence not to answer. And the question rang out through the assembly, I adjure thee by the living God, that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God. Priests and rabbis, scribes, Pharisees and Sadducees, learned men of Israel, they all knew what the question meant. They sprang to their feet in the excitement, craning forward to catch the reply. With peace, Jesus looked up at the high priest, and his voice rang out, You have said it yourself, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Caiaphas swung round on the assembled rabbis, tearing his robe from top to bottom according to custom. His voice was shrill with victory. He shouted, What need have we of further witnesses? The charge of blasphemy had been established. It was sufficient. The Sanhedrin had no choice but to impose the solemn sentence, he is liable to be put to death.
Simon Peter had seen the last flickering torch disappear around the turn of the path that wound down the hill. Peter stumbled blindly down the hill. He instinctively hurried to catch up with the others, yet he was not anxious to get too close. He saw them go inside the house of the high priest. There was a woman at the door. He went to follow the others inside, but the woman stopped him and said, Are you not one of this man's disciples? Peter denied his Lord and said, I am not. Because the night was cold, the soldiers and the temple guards had kindled a fire. Peter joined their group and warmed himself by the fire. He was not paying much attention to their conversation until one of the soldiers nudged him and said, You were with him. You were with the Nazarene. And Peter said for the second time, I do not know the man. A servant in the crowd said, Certainly he's one of the Galileans. Just listen to his accent. I am sure. I saw him go in the garden, for my kinsman was wounded by one of them who drew a sword, and if I'm not mistaken, it was this fellow here. Then Peter, beginning to curse and swear, said, I don't know the man you're talking about. He used language he had not used before. The group standing around the fire was silent. It was a silence so intense that the crowing of a distant cock was like a bugle call. Immediately Peter remembered the Lord's prophecy, Before the cock crows, you shall deny me 3 times. He turned away from the fire, and with tears streaming down his face, he saw ahead of him the stairway that led to Pilate's palace. It was just at that moment that Christ was being led up the stairs. The Lord had heard. He had heard it all. Christ paused on the stairs and looked down over the rail. He looked right into the very soul of Peter. The eyes of the two met at that awful moment. Through his tears, all else was a blur to Peter. The world seemed to stand still at that terrible moment, a moment that would last forever. Peter looked into the eyes of his friend, the one he loved, and denied.
The Roman governor Pontius Pilate paused at the head of the marble staircase. With cool scrutiny, he regarded the crowd below him. The prisoner was dressed in a simple white robe, open at the neck, wrinkled and soiled from rough handling. The Roman governor raised his baton as a signal that the trial could begin and asked, "What is the charge against this man?" The reply was insolent. "If he were not an evildoer, we would not have brought him to you." Pilate looked at the prisoner. An evildoer? No, this prisoner was no vicious character. Take him away and deal with him according to your own law. A howl went up among the crowd. "It is not lawful for us to put any man to death." Pilate hesitated. So that was what they wanted. He could see bloodlust in their eyes. He looked once again at the prisoner. His was the only calm face in that sea of anger. For a moment there was silence. Then Pilate's involuntary question surprised even himself. "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." It was a flat denial of the insinuations made by the priests that the Nazarene was plotting treason. He had learned what he wanted to know. This man was harmless. He held up his baton for silence, and in a ringing voice he said, "I find no fault with this man." The chief priests were now even angrier than ever. Prompted by the priests, the crowd shouted, "Crucify! Crucify! Crucify!" Pilate could scarcely make himself heard. "Would you have me crucify your king?" This outraged the crowd even more. "We have no king but Caesar." Desperately, Pilate tried once again. "There is nothing in this Jesus that deserves death. I shall scourge him and let him go." But the mob would not have it so. The sea of humanity before him took up the cry again, "Crucify, crucify, crucify." Pilate stood there waiting, unable to hide his contempt. The prisoner before him was pale and very tired, swaying a bit on his feet. Pilate called to one of his servants standing close by. He spoke to him, and the servant hurried inside. Pilate looked over at the priests, and seeing the hate in their eyes and hearing the savagery of their shouting, he found himself wondering about their religion, marveling at any religion that would permit them to behave like this. By this time, the servant returned bearing a basin of water and a towel. Pilate, unable to make himself heard at all now, wanted to dramatize something. Deliberately, in sight of them all, slowly he washed his hands. Slowly he dried them. Then he stepped forward and said clearly and deliberately, "I am innocent of the blood of this just man." And with loud shouts of triumph, the people yelled, "His blood be upon us and on our children." Pilate shuddered involuntarily. His last act as he turned Jesus over to be scourged and crucified, was to write the inscription to be put over his cross in Latin, in Greek, in Hebrew: Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. From the courtyard there came the sound of a flagellum, into which had been fastened bits of lead and glass and bone and chain, striking again and again the bared back of the King of the Jews.
The narrow streets were crowded. From every balcony and latticed window came the sound of voices, scraps of laughter. There were men and women carrying burdens, baskets of vegetables, casks of wine, water bags. There were children playing in the streets, calling to each other. Shepherds were coming in from the hills. Pilgrims and visitors for the feast were pouring in through the gates, mingling with the merchants from the villages round about. It was not easy to make one's way through the crowd. It was especially difficult for the procession that started out from the governor's palace. 2 legionnaires led the way, clearing the crowd aside as best they could with curses and careless blows. Between 2 files of soldiers staggered 3 condemned men, each carrying a heavy bar of wood with its crosspiece on which he was to be executed. The crosses were heavy, and the first of the condemned men, Jesus of Nazareth, was at the point of collapse. The lashing with the flagellum had taken the last of his strength. Sweat poured down his face, and he swayed now and then under the weight of the cross. It was hard to keep step. A group of women went with the procession, their faces half hidden by their veils, but their grief could not be hidden. Some were sobbing. Others were praying. Others were moaning in a deep grief that knows not what it says or does. Most of the crowd hardly knew what was going on. They did not understand. They caught the infection of the mob spirit. They shouted to the first of the 3 victims, the one who had an absurd crown on his head. They shouted at him until they were roughly pushed aside by the soldiers. It was an ugly situation as the procession went slowly along the way that would forever be known as the Via Dolorosa.
Simon of Cyrene had just arrived in Judea and was about to enter the holy city as a pilgrim for the festival. He and a big procession met right at the city gate. The procession was headed by some Roman soldiers. There was something strange about it all, but before he could understand what it was, Simon was caught up in it and swept out through the gate again. He stumbled along, tightly wedged in the very center of this crowd. He noticed that there were 3 men who staggered under the weight of crosses made of rough, heavy wood. One of them was strangely appealing, his face arresting. Simon felt his gaze returning again and again to that one face. He noticed that blood was trickling down from wounds in the man's brow. There was a twig of long-thorned briar twisted around in the shape of a crown that had been cruelly pushed down on the man's head. Everything was forgotten as he watched this man carrying this cross. The man's eyes were almost blinded by the blood that trickled down from under that grotesque crown on his head. And then the man looked up, and as Simon looked at him, he looked at Simon. And as these two looked at each other, the man with the cross stumbled. And the soldiers, seeing the Nazarene was almost too exhausted to carry the cross any further, laid hands on Simon and ordered him to carry it. Simon's heart almost stopped beating. He tried to speak, but no words came. A few minutes before, he had been a lonely pilgrim, quietly approaching the holy city. And now, there he was in the middle of a procession of howling men and women, carrying on his shoulders a cross on which someone was going to die. A look of gratitude and love flashed across the eyes of Jesus as Simon lifted the heavy load from those tired, bloody shoulders. The look that passed between them, Simon never forgot as long as he lived. For no man can look at Jesus of Nazareth and remain the same.
The noisy procession wound its way through Jerusalem. And so the crowd came to Golgotha, a hill shaped like a skull, outside the city gates. The men carrying the crosses were roughly pushed to the ground by the soldiers, their outstretched hands tied to the crossbeam. Only as the nails were driven in did the shouting of the noisy crowd stop. There was a hush. Most of them were stunned, horrified. Even the hardest of them were silenced. Mary, the mother of Jesus, closed her eyes and stopped her ears. She could not bear the thud of the hammer. John, from time to time, wiped away his tears with the back of his hand. Peter stood on the fringe of the crowd, blinded by hot tears that filled his eyes, while his very heart broke. A group of soldiers took hold of the crossbeam and lifted it slowly off the ground. With each movement, the nails tore at the shredded flesh in the wrist of the Nazarene. The crowd swayed in the air for a moment, and then with a thud, dropped into the hole prepared for it. When the first spasm of pain had subsided, Jesus opened his eyes. Over the heads of the crowd, he could see the city shining in the midday sun. Near, there was a hillside carpeted with anemone and cyclamen. For just a moment, a gentle spring wind blowing across the face of the suffering man blew away the smell of the blood and wafted to him the fragrance of flowers. And he saw a single lark silently circling high about the hillside.
There were eyes watching this man on his cross, unbelieving eyes, eyes with gloating in them, eyes that looked and never saw. Faces were looking at him, convulsed faces, snarling, invictive faces, faces that through his pain-glazed eyes seemed to melt and run together. Fingers pointed up to him, long, bony fingers, mocking and accusing fingers, fingers of scorn and ridicule. The crowd hurled his own words back at him, but they were barbs dipped in venom and shot from snarling lips like poisoned arrows. He saved others. Let him save himself. If you really are the Christ, prove it. come down from the cross. They shouted until they were hoarse. The noise was so great that only a few of them, standing near the cross, heard what he said when his lips moved in prayer. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do.
There was noise, confused noise, that beat upon his ears with an added pain. There was demonic laughter that enjoyed suffering. There was hoarse shouting that taunted and mocked. From one side of him, sighs of pain and the soft moans of a dying thief. And on the other side, blasphemous curses, terrible to hear. One of the thieves, drugged and half drunk, cried out to Jesus, "Can't you see how we suffer? If you are the Son of God, take us down from these crosses. Save us and yourself." Then pain gripped him and he began to curse and swear, blaming Jesus for his pain. But the other turned his head so that he could see Jesus. And he said to his companion, "Do you not even fear God? You and I are under the same sentence of condemnation, and we, indeed, justly. We are receiving what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he turned to Jesus and said, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus, his face drawn with suffering, but his voice still kind, answered, "This very day, when this pain is over, we shall be together, you and I, in paradise."
The sun rose higher and higher. Time oozed out slowly, like the blood that dripped from the cross. Jesus opened his eyes again and saw his mother standing with John beside her. He called out to John, who came close. Strength was fast ebbing away. "Thou shalt take care of her, John." And John, choked with tears, put his arm around the shoulder of Mary. Jesus said to his mother, "He will be thy son." And Mary, nearing a state of collapse, flung herself on John's breast, sobbing quietly. His lips were parched. He spoke with difficulty, "I am thirsty." One of the soldiers went and filled a sponge with sour wine. He put it onto a reed and raised it to his lips. Sour wine, the final drink for the one who gave us living water.
The women beneath the cross stood praying for Jesus and the thieves. The centurion was silent, although every now and then he would look up at Jesus with a strange look on his face, puzzled, wondering, marveling. The rest of the soldiers had been playing nickel bones in the shadow of the crosses. Agreeing that they did not want to tear Jesus' seamless robe, they tossed for it. The man on the cross would not need it again. And then they sat down and they watched him there. They were all witnesses standing at the crossroads of history, and they saw nothing. Jesus moved his head uneasily against the hard wood of the cross, like a sick man moves his head on a hot pillow. My God, why have you forsaken me? The sky was growing strangely dark. A thunderstorm seemed to be blowing up from the mountains, and clouds hid the sun. Women on the converging highways beyond the hill took children by the hand and began hurrying back to the city. People looked up at the sky and became frightened. It was an uncanny darkness. Suddenly, Jesus opened his eyes and gave a loud cry. Well, the gladness in his voice startled all who heard it. It sounded like a shout of victory. It is finished! Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. And with that cry, he died.
It was plain to see that the Nazarene was dead. Yet the Roman centurion who watched could not believe that any crucified one could die in just 6 hours. To make sure, one of the soldiers pierced Christ's side with a spear, and the last remaining drops of his blood were poured out. Yes, he was dead. There was no need to break his legs in an effort to hasten the end. During those last hours, John had tried over and over to persuade Mary to leave, but she would not. Her son was hanging there. So long as there was a breath of life, no, she would not leave him. But Mary herself was nearing a state of collapse. When it was over, she flung herself on John's breast, sobbing quietly. Salome, John's own mother, and some of the other women who had been watching afar off, left the outskirts of the crowd and came running to help. When John lifted Mary up, put his arms around her shoulders, and gently led her down the hill toward home.
Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the great Jewish council, went to Pilate to ask for the body of Jesus. Not until the centurion confirmed the statement that the Galilean was really dead did Pilate grant Joseph his request. With some haste, Joseph, with Nicodemus to help him, then took down the disfigured body from the cross. Gently, they wound the body of Jesus in strips of clean linen, 8 feet long, with spices between the layers, as was the custom of the Jews. And as their hands busied themselves with the sad work, Nicodemus remembered the night when he had laid aside his work for the Sanhedrin and had gone out under the stars to ask questions of the Galilean. For all the rest of my life, he thought, I shall remember his words. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him may not perish, but may have eternal life. And now he was dead. Nicodemus was tortured by the knowledge of all the things he might have said and done while Jesus was alive. Now he thought, it is too late. As he looked at the still face of his friend, his tears fell, making little smudges on the white linen. Then Joseph and Nicodemus carried the body of their Lord to a newly made tomb in the counselor's garden, a tomb which he had hewn out of rock for himself. After the Sabbath, they would arrange for a burial with proper ceremony. For now it would be enough to roll a great round stone to the door of the sepulchre, for the evening star was already shining, and no more work could be done until the Sabbath was over. The two men and the women who had followed at a distance to see where the body of their master was being laid went away, very silent, very sad, hailed as king on the Sabbath before, dead like a common thief on Friday. Now all hope was gone. Christ was dead.